Regularly scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm the chair of this committee, and I'm joined today by council members Warsami, Kano, and Council President Johnson. I will note that council member Andrew Johnson is not here due to recovery from a surgery, so we will be expecting him to return soon. This is a meeting with a couple of very major items, including an overview of what happened in the legislative session. And even though it seems so soon after that session ended, we also are talking about our capital requests, our bonding requests to the state due to submission deadlines. First, we have one consent item. This is approving the appointment of Councilmember John Quincy to a 2-year term beginning June 26, 2017 through June 25, 2019 as the city's designated representative to the Noise Oversight Committee for the airport, and the appointment of Lauren Olson as an alternate. So I will move approval of that item and see if there's any discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, and that item is approved. Next, we turn to our two major discussion items, and for item number 2, who is teeing us off? All right, Ms. Lish.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I've got our order of operations.
Right, so our item right now is the state capital investment bill.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Melissa Lesh with the IGR department. As the chair just noted, we just finished up the 2017 legislative session with a very sizable bonding bill at the state capitol. The city of Minneapolis was successful in some of our top priorities being included in the final bonding bill that was just passed in the special session. The city's top priority, which is a joint project with Hennepin County, which is a $25 million request for our local share. Our contribution to the 35W and Lake Transit Access Project was funded in the bill, as well as our number 2 priority, the 10th Avenue Bridge, which was a request for $31.875 million. Thrilled and pleasantly surprised to have been successful in both of those projects. And then the third item that's a city project that was funded in the bill was the restoration of the Pioneers and Soldiers Cemetery fence, and that was a request of $1.029 million, and that was also successful in the final bonding bill. And when we go through the legislative summary, we'll get into a little bit more detail. There were additional projects that were not city projects, but are located within the city of Minneapolis, and we're very happy to see that they received funding as well. So we'll get into that detail a little bit more as we go through the legislative agenda, the legislative summary. But for now.
So, and just as you are pausing right there, and I know we'll have more time to talk about this when you get to talking through the legislative session, I just wanted to pause though and note how significant these accomplishments were, both in terms of these were very significant requests to the state, and had been on the list for many years. I will say for the 35W Transit Access Project, this is one that has been in the works for, I don't know, like 20 years, 25 years. And this iteration is just one of the last iterations of how this request has been in place. And I had been very hopeful that before I left the city council that we could say that we finally accomplished this as a bonding goal. So I just want to thank our very talented staff and Ms. Lesh leading this work for really what is a significant statewide accomplishment on kind of all those fronts, but also on this one in particular. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure. So with that, as you noted, Madam Chair, we just finished the 2017 legislative session about 5 minutes ago, so it's certainly time to start preparing for 2018. And the reason we're preparing so early is that the city participates in a process with the state for our projects to be considered. So we are being governed, and I'll get into some dates and some process in a moment. We are being governed by a larger process. So we appreciate city staff responding so quickly to a very abbreviated timeline for 2018. So just a very brief overview about what state capital investment is, kind of the bonding 101, and I'll use those words interchangeably. Capital investment and bonding is really the shorthand. Just as the city has the capacity to participate in bonding, so does the state of Minnesota. And the state pays for some types of capital improvement projects by borrowing money by issuing bonds, which are promises to repay the money borrowed at a specific time and interest rate. The vast majority of the bonds that we see moving in a legislative bonding bill are general obligation or GO bonds. There are other types of bonds that you will occasionally see in state bonding bills, such as appropriation bonds and revenue bonds, but they are certainly the minority. The vast majority of a bonding bill is going to be GO bonds, and they are backed by the full faith and credit and taxing powers of the state of Minnesota. And finally, I'll note that occasionally you do see cash or just a direct general fund appropriation included in a bonding bill. And those are, that general fund cash is often awarded for projects that don't really fit the very strict criteria and guidelines that are required for those other types of bonds, GO, appropriation, revenue, and so forth. It gives a little bit more flexibility and sometimes is included in a bonding bill, but by no means is that a regular occurrence. I mentioned that there are some requirements that accompany GO bonds, and that's what I'm going to be focusing right on today, not the other types of bonds, as these are the bonds that really support city projects that we pursue at the state level. These bonds are governed by constitutional requirements and statutory requirements. The most important constitutional requirement that we really focus on is that the project does need to be owned by a public entity in order to receive state bonding awards. When something is not owned by a public entity, there are all sorts of other revenue sources. As I mentioned, appropriation bonds are used sometimes. That's when you'll see that general fund cash come into play, is when the legislature wants to support those projects that don't happen to be owned by a public entity. The Constitution requires that these projects be publicly owned. They must be for a public purpose. That purpose must be specified in law. The bonds must be authorized in the Constitution and must not mature for more than 20 years. In addition to these constitutional requirements, there are also statutory requirements that govern the state bonding process. Those requirements are largely laid out in Minnesota Statute 16A.86, at least the requirements that govern state bonding that is awarded to local units of government and political subdivisions, of which the city of Minneapolis is one. One of the largest and most significant requirements laid out in statute there is that a 50% match from non-state revenue is required for all capital investment awards to political subdivisions, with very few exceptions. And how Minnesota Management and Budget evaluates that 50% match really is going to depend on the project. Sometimes they will consider previous expenditures that have been made. They'll look back in time and see, you paid X, Y, and Z for the land, or you've already spent this much on a pre-design and design, so we'll count that for your 50% match. But those do need to be non-state sources, and they are pretty strict about that. So if part of your local 50% match is, say, another grant you received from the state through another pathway, that's considered a state resource, even though you didn't get it from bonding. They really are looking for non-state sources. So that could be federal money, that could be money just from the local unit of government itself, but they really are pretty strict at looking at those non-state revenues. And once that 50% match is recognized by MMP, it is at that point that if you are successful in getting your project in a bonding bill, MMB will not release the funds to that unit of government until that 50% match is either in the bank, or there's a very clear funding plan in place, such as Nicollet Mall, where there's a clear agreement as to where that 50% match is going to be coming over the future years. And then switching to our discussion about the city process and how the city goes about deciding what the city is going to be submitting to Minnesota Management and Budget, we primarily focus on city-owned projects, circling back to that constitutional requirement that projects do need to be owned by a local unit of government. So that really guides much of our thought in this area. And historically, the city has really focused on preserving existing city infrastructure, public safety needs, economic development, and historic preservation of city city projects. And this planning does involve all city departments. You would, of course, suspect the usual suspects of Public Works and CPED often have the most number of projects, but as you'll see when I show you our current list, you'll also see bonding requests from, for example, the fire department is looking at expanding the current emergency operations and training facility. So we do reach out and engage all city departments in this process, although you will, of course, see more projects coming from those primary departments. MMB, excuse me, I just skipped ahead. Minnesota Management and Budget is the state agency that shepherds us through the bonding process, and they are the ones responsible then for managing those bonds once they are let, and they're typically the agency that manages the reporting requirements for the bonds that are awarded to local units of government, along with specific state agencies that might oversee a particular project. MMB is also the agency that oversees the governor's bonding bill. And the reason the city always participates in MMB's process is because projects must be submitted to MMB for review to be considered for inclusion in the governor's bonding bill. The governor has the authority to, but historically really does not include bonding projects in his bonding bill that were not submitted to Minnesota Management and Budget and did not go through that process. And what I failed to note here is that in addition to being submitted to MMB, once projects are submitted to MMB, we also have tours that we do typically in the summer and fall of the odd-numbered year, which will be this year, leading into the even-numbered session, which is the traditional bonding session. We will bring the Senate and House capital investment committees, along with our partners at the county and the park board traditionally, on a day-long tour of our jurisdiction's projects. So that MMB submission process also really jumpstarts that legislative tour process as well. So the reason we're talking about this today, Madam Chair, is that you'll see that preliminary submissions are due to Minnesota Management and Budget next Friday on June 16th. A council resolution needs to accompany that submission. So that's why we're discussing this today. After the preliminary submission, you'll see the next deadline is July 17th, when MMB will submit all of the local projects that they've received at the preliminary submission date to the legislature, and that is required by statute. Between then the July date and October 20th, October 20th is when the final bonding project requests are due to MMB for consideration of the governor. That's really an opportunity for us to fine-tune proposals, update numbers, add additional visuals, things of that nature before those projects are submitted to the governor for consideration. And then the governor is required to submit his capital budget proposal to the legislature on January 15th then of the even-numbered year, and that January 15th is the required date of the even-numbered year. And then again, a note that that council resolution must accompany our submission. MMB, as they're governed by statute, is required to require us, local units of government, to rank our projects in priority order. This does not bind the governor or the legislature from funding projects in that priority order, but those rankings are taken very seriously by the governor and by the legislature, and they do tend to respect the prioritization of local units of government. What's the complications, I have a note there about complications with that list, is that just because something is on the list or not on the list, it can have different implications for the city being successful in our pursuit of bonding awards at the state. And there's just, this might be on the next slide, there's some discussion about kind of non-city owned projects on the next slide.
Can I just ask a question about the city process slide you already went
Yep.
through? So again, because this is so soon after the end of the legislative session, where we've only just discovered what actually did get funded in the bonding bill for this session, is what opportunities are there, if any, for us to change what might be the rankings that we identify or modify our list beyond what is submitted next Friday?
Thank you, Madam Chair. An excellent question. You'll note that the June 16th date for next Friday is a preliminary submission date, and MMB understands that there, especially due to the late nature of this year's bonding bill, that there will be changes to jurisdictions lists and that there is flexibility in adjusting those prior to the October 20th final submission date.
Okay, so if we did change that, we would come back to this committee and get approval for a modification and then submit that one way or another.
Yes, Madam Chair, and I believe we probably would also need to amend the resolution that we're passing today
Mhm.
because MMB does require that to be included in our final submission.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. And just to touch on the topic of non-city owned projects, because the connection between how we rank projects and the non-city owned projects. As I noted in the beginning of my comments on this year's bonding bill, there are a whole host of projects that are located in the city of Minneapolis but are not owned by the city. And the city has historically focused our lobbying efforts, our political capital and energy on focusing on city projects for the constitutional and statutory requirements that I laid out. There also really are just some political realities of capital investment and bonding at the state capitol. Unlike other types of legislation, the bonding bill just is only so big. And a well-crafted bonding bill serves all parts of the state of Minnesota. A bonding bill requires a 3/5 vote by the legislature, not a simple majority to pass. And because of that, that was a very wise addition to the Constitution because that really does require that the legislature create a balanced bonding bill that provides equal support to all different regions and entities and types of entities and cities and counties around the state. And because of that, at the end of the day, the reality is when the legislature is looking at the bottom line as to what projects are in the city of Minneapolis, what projects are owned by the city, what projects are University of Minnesota, what projects are in Duluth or Hennepin County or wherever it may be, that they are looking for some balance and some parity and equity amongst those types of jurisdictions. And that if a project is on our list, that the implication is that if something is listed, it could very easily subtract from what might be a top priority or a number 2 priority. That your jurisdiction really is only going to be, in the minds of lawmakers, allotted X number of bonding dollars. And if that is spent on a lower priority or on a project that is not a city project, that would then, in their minds and then on the ledger, be subtracted from what would be the city priorities. So we have to be very cautious with how we compile our list and how we advocate for our projects and those of others.
So I had another question on this end, just because unlike the city of St. Paul, which submits for, well, we have a park board that has a separately elected board. They set their own list of bonding priorities that align with their mission. We at the city do not change what their decisions are. And I just mentioned St. Paul because St. Paul does not have a separately elected park board or other things like that. So how does the park board's list affect what might be the dollars awarded to the city of Minneapolis?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Another great question. So uh, when we have joint projects, for example, the Upper Harbor Terminal, which will be a joint endeavor between the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Park Board, because of just the technical nature of the MMB process, only one jurisdiction can formally, technically push the send button and submit that to Minnesota Management and Budget. So while you might not see that project, for example, on our formal list that we submit to MMB, that will be a top priority of the city of Minneapolis. We just can't both formally submit that to the MMB process. So that would be an example of a project that we would work on together, that we would lobby together, but that we will, at least in this preliminary submission, the park board is going to be the one submitting that project, for example. Politically, when you leave the city of Minneapolis, there are a lot of legislators who, because you have cities like St. Paul that have their park board as part of their city, the fact that there's an actual political subdivision distinction between the city of Minneapolis and the park board, kind of inside baseball for a lot of people around the state. They just see it as Minneapolis. And so a project like that, for example, being on the park board's list would still be looked at as a city of Minneapolis project. If that answers your question. So just a couple last notes on non-city owned projects. We talked about some of the political realities, and then also just a note about what the trends really have been and the reality of what kind of fiscal agency or sponsorship might be. Historically, the legislature really was conservative in how they approached whether it be nonprofit organizations or entities that just were not other units of government or political subdivisions, and they were not included in the bonding bill. And then starting maybe about 25 years ago, there was this idea that if a local unit of government acted as a fiscal agent or a sponsor of a project, then that would create some space for, again, nonprofit organizations or other non public entities to participate in the bonding bill. That was not the practice for most of the time that we were doing capital investment. It's just kind of a recent trend. And you'll hear the words fiscal agency and sponsor a project put out there, and that's the shorthand. There's really not a great way to describe it in a short way other than those types of phrases. But the responsibilities, as I noted in the beginning of my comments, go far beyond any kind of just an accounting structure, that there are constitutional and statutory requirements and obligations that then would befall whoever the local unit of government or public entity was that took on that responsibility. And to that end, because there are so many outstanding organizations in the city of Minneapolis that support our residents and are great amenities for our city that need that type of capital investment and infrastructure support that the city might not want to be the owner of. The city of Minneapolis has been working with the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, MMB, different state agencies, the governor's office, and other public entities and local units of government to identify alternative funding sources for these valuable resources that are just not owned by the jurisdictions that they happen to be located in.
And, I just want to say I got a copy of a letter recently that I think went to other council members too that referenced what's the process for non-city projects. So, for example, a nonprofit-led project that the city would need to then have some ownership interest in. Is there a separate way that those projects are submitted to the state, or is there just one process? I feel like sometimes that is confusing to people.
Madam Chair, it is, and it's something that MMB is aware of, and that they would like to do some additional outreach to nonprofits, and that's kind of the hope with partnering with the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits is that there could be some additional partnership in education and help with nonprofits kind of identifying that process. That the MMB process really is just for projects that are owned by a unit of government or political subdivision, and for state agencies as well. Nonprofits tend to, if they want to pursue bonding money, will partner with a legislator and introduce legislation. That can be another route to them pursuing capital investment support. And again, they tend to be the most successful when they pursue general fund, that cash alternative that we talked about earlier. Sometimes you've seen appropriation bonds and things of that nature, but those tend to be standalone pieces of legislation that those entities pursue on their own. And again, the city of Minneapolis is always thrilled to see investment in the city and support for partners and infrastructure and nonprofits and things of that nature. But what we really do focus our purview on are city-owned projects. And then finally, Madam Chair, for the 2018, and I say the state bonding MMB submissions, and I said that very specifically to kind of capture what we talked about a few moments ago around the Upper Harbor Terminal, that we might not be submitting that project, but it will be top priority for the city of Minneapolis in the 2018 cycle, even though we aren't the ones just turning in the paperwork, so to speak, to MMB. There are many other city projects that are currently in the queue that we'll be looking at over the next few years, other city infrastructure, but these really are the top ones that are teed up and ready for 2018. And we really also focus on city projects that are also of statewide and regional significance. That's a really strong priority for the legislature and the governor. They're not looking to fund local projects. They're looking to fund projects that Of course, something's always located somewhere, but that it does have a larger significance to the state of Minnesota or the region. So our top priority is listed right now on this list is the Emergency Operations and Training Facility Phase 2. This is number one on our list currently because it is the only City of Minneapolis project that was not funded in the 2017 bill. All of our other, we had 3 other projects, as I noted before, that were fully funded in the 2017 bill. And a new project that we're going to have a presentation on today is the Central City Storm Tunnel, and that would be a request for 50% of the cost of the maintenance and repair to that of $19 million. And then, Madam Chair, I have a note on the bottom, again, around Upper Harbor Terminal, noting that this is a top priority of the City of Minneapolis, and that because MMB only permits one local jurisdiction to submit the project, the Park Board will be submitting that on next Friday, and then we'll have further discussions about how we want to approach the lobbying effort around that project going forward.
Thank you, Ms. Lesh. And I will say I think it would be good to come back to this committee once there is I understand there also is some discussion about just what is the city portion of the Upper Harbor Terminal. And I say that not to indicate there isn't a city portion, there is a city portion, but just what's the definition of that, what actually is the project. And I think it would be good to come back to this committee, regardless of whether this stays on the Park Board list or whether it gravitates to the city list, so that we would be in a more of a leadership position on the lobbying around this project, so we can understand what would be the scope of an ask. So
Certainly, Madam Chair, we'll do that.
okay. Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just a question, I can't remember what the dollar amount was on the Park Board's Upper Harbor request.
$15 million, Madam.
15.
15, 1
Oh,
5, yes.
Thank you.
And we can forward the committee the resolution that the Park Board passed, I believe, last night, that breaks down a little bit what's baked into that 15.
And Council President, did you have more on that?
I do.
Yeah, it would be good maybe to see, do we know the Park Board's full list? And what is that again? Because as you described, this all kind of gets lumped into what is the City of Minneapolis request.
Sure. So what I can tell you is that their number one priority for the resolution that was passed last night is the Mississippi River Habitat and Public Water Access Project. I believe that's Halls Island, shorthand for us locals. And that was a $12 million request. Number 2 is 26th Avenue North for $3 million. And then it's my understanding, and I was not able to watch the proceedings, but that there was an addition of a third project was added last night, which is the Waterworks. I'm still learning about that project. I believe that was a $3 million request on there. And then their fourth priority then, because of the insertion of this new project that was not reflected in their original resolution, would be the Upper Harbor Terminal site remediation, redevelopment, and public lands, and that was a $15 million request. And I can get a copy of this and forward it to the committee.
Yeah. And just, I will say, knowing that Upper Harbor is number 4 on the Park Board's list, I don't know that that fully reflects how the city might think of what the priority should be, and so that's kind of another issue. And I also am not sure I understand kind of what is the Park Board, so their ask is about Park Board stuff, and I feel a little confused on what's kind of the Park Board end of the project versus how the city might characterize our end of the project and how that might change, if at all, what is the request to the legislature. So,
Sure.
I mean, all of these, I think, are questions. I know there's many council members up here are much more involved than I am in monitoring that project and being involved. So,
Yeah, and Madam Chair, we'll be working on this with this being a preliminary submission. We'll be working with our partners at the Park Board to really nail down what does that ask look like, who's going to be the lead agency, and some of the questions that you raised. So we'll get that locked down before the final submission for sure.
okay, Council President Johnson.
Ms. Lesh, do you, I realize it's a preliminary submission, but I mean, do we anticipate that other units of government will have a complete list? I just don't want to be behind the 8 ball because we haven't um, um, defined exactly what, we want to do and end up, not having some things that are really important on our list.
Yeah.
Quickly, because when's the next one? June or no? October?
Final submissions are October 20th.
October. Yeah. Mm.
Madam Chair and Council President,
Then we'd miss the tour.
well, you can't miss the tour.
No, but
No, our
what I'm saying is if we
Yes.
wait until October to do our list, we miss the summer tours then.
Yeah. Madam Chair and Council President, we would have it, we would know for sure kind of what our list would be before then. Our tour tends to be November, December. They'd like to be outside with us at the end of the year, apparently, the legislative committees. It's not terribly unusual for local governments to have, for there to be some flux in the beginning of a bonding cycle for that preliminary date and to see change between a preliminary date and the final submission date. That's why they give you that large chunk of time, especially given the extraordinarily late nature of the 2017 bonding bill passing. I think a lot of entities either had things included in the bill that they weren't anticipating or excluded that they thought were going to be in. So it's a fairly common occurrence that there's movement between your preliminary submission and your final. So we don't feel behind the eight ball in that regard, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from council members on this? I'm not seeing that, so maybe let's keep going with the presentation you have planned.
Okay. Well, that's all I have right now on capital investment, Madam Chair. And then
I thought you were going to have someone present on Central City Storm Tunnel.
Oh, we're on to that part. Yes, we are. And Madam Chair, because Central City Storm Tunnel is a new project, we're going to give you a brief presentation on that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm Katrina Kessler. I'm the Director of Surface Water and Sewers Division within Public Works, and I'm going to provide a presentation on the Central City Storm Tunnel project. The Central City Tunnel is part of a network of 16 miles of tunnel that underlay Minneapolis. The tunnels are a critical component of our stormwater system, and they're designed to convey stormwater from some of our most densely populated and developed areas. Together with the complementary MnDOT tunnels, these tunnels drain approximately 10,000 acres of area within the city, or 27% of the overall city. The Central City Tunnel, which is highlighted here in yellow, is approximately 3.9 miles, and this drains the whole of downtown from approximately 1st Street Northeast to almost where US Bank Stadium is today, from 12th Street South to 1st Street North. And the tunnel is not only a vital piece of Minneapolis infrastructure, but it supports regional growth and development. This slide lists some of the overlying buildings where stormwater runoff drains to the Central City Tunnel. And these entities like Target headquarters, Wells Fargo, Orchestra Hall, they serve communities far beyond the city of Minneapolis. The tunnels function in concert as part of our overall stormwater system, and it's important to recognize that this spans the entire city. So we have 556 miles of stormwater pipe, we've got 25,000 catch basins, 25 pump stations, 150 grit chambers, and a number of stormwater detention ponds to improve water quality, all designed to minimize risks to human health and the environment. Like much of our underground infrastructure in the city, our stormwater tunnels are aging. The oldest tunnels in the city, and a portion of the Central City is included in this, date back to the late 1800s. They were constructed again to facilitate development and drainage, and they collect runoff from tributary storm pipes and direct it to the Mississippi River. The tunnels underneath downtown, including the Central City Tunnel, are located 65 to 100 feet below the surface, and they're in the sandstone formation. They were originally constructed with technology of the late 19th century using shovels and picks, and they were then lined with concrete or brick. The tunnels, together with the rest of the system, have served the city quite well. however, they are deteriorating. The primary cause of deterioration is pressurization resulting from hydraulic overloading. Essentially, there's too much water in the tunnels. As noted, the tunnels were built in the late 19th century, early 20th century, designed to handle runoff from that time period. As more development happened in the city, more water came to the tunnels, and they were never envisioned to operate entirely full, let alone with 100 head of pressure upstream. The city's success in separating our originally combined storm sewers and sanitary sewers have also directed more water to the storm sewers. And these factors, combined with a changing climate that brings more intense, frequent rain events, means that the deterioration and pressurization of the tunnels is increasing. Today, many of the tunnels are over capacity during even moderate rain events, and this includes the Central City Tunnel downtown. The pressure in the tunnel leads to cracks, and during rain events, when the tunnels are full, water is forced out of the cracks into the surrounding sandstone, creating voids. And as the water then recedes, the sandstone is eroded and falls back in as sand into the tunnel, decreasing the overall capacity of the tunnel. And the voids that are created on the exterior side can compromise the integrity of the overall tunnel system. This picture, which is a little bit hard to see, shows what actually happened when a storm system was pressurized and the tunnel liner cracked, was lifted up, moved over, and set down in another location. So this is 6 inches of concrete, so it's a lot of power. Pressurized tunnels also represent a public safety risk. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for pressurized tunnels to cause manhole covers to blow or to see water surging up onto the right-of-way. This video, which was captured at a manhole at 25th Avenue Southeast and Como, drains to the Como Tunnel, and we fixed this location last summer with the construction of a surge chamber, but it is a good representation of what can happen above ground when you have pressurized tunnel. Perhaps even more dangerous are the risks that can be posed underground that we can't see. Some of you probably remember the summer of 2010 when we had an intense rain event in downtown Minneapolis. The storm actually pressurized the entire Central City Tunnel and resulted in fractures in the Hennepin Avenue and the 2nd Avenue. The Hennepin Avenue and 2nd Avenue segments. Under Hennepin Avenue, water jetted out of the cracks, resulting in a lot of infiltration after the fact of sand. We ended up with 1.5 feet of sand in the tunnel for that entire segment, which is a significant decrease in capacity. A lot of that sand ended up in the Mississippi River, unfortunately, and what was left took months of expensive construction and city work to remove. Underneath the 2nd Avenue portion of the tunnel, water actually exploded out the side, which then unfortunately penetrated a nearby sanitary Met Council interceptor. As the water receded, then untreated wastewater migrated back into the sanitary tunnel and resulted in an overflow of untreated wastewater into the Mississippi River. In response to this, the city executed an emergency contract with consultants and an engineering firm and did expedited repairs. And following that, we did a lot of work to fill and identify voids exterior to those segments of the tunnel to minimize impacts of pressurization in these areas going forward. Also, in response to the 2010 events, we completed an entire comprehensive assessment of all of the storm tunnels and developed a plan to address them through rehab going forward. The city increased the funding to the Stormwater Utility Fund at that time, and now we're spending between $7 and $10 million on rehab on the tunnel system every year. This includes quantifying voids, looking at structural integrity, as well as minimizing groundwater infiltration. The bottom left photo was taken during rehab that occurred in the recent past in the Central City Tunnel near Washington and Portland Avenue. Just downstream of this is the oldest segment of the tunnel, which is within the scope of this project, and it's undersized. So this is a problem that we have. The photo on the right was taken this winter underneath Nicollet and 4th, and this gentleman is identifying and filling voids as well on the exterior of the tunnel liner. The need for the Central City project was identified in that 2011 comprehensive assessment. The goal of the project is to reduce the pressurization, to reduce risk of tunnel failure, to reduce costs in operation and maintenance, and to extend the service life and to support the critical infrastructure that overlies this part of the city. The scope is this line in green. This is 0.7 miles that collects stormwater from those upper branches of the downtown tunnel. This is the oldest, again, and most undersized portion of the tunnel. And I just want to point out that this project will not dig up the brand-new Washington Avenue, and that as we consider the options to address the need to increase hydraulic capacity, we're very mindful of the fact that that project is ongoing, and we will look for other ways to do this work, and there are a number of other ways to do that. So we are considering options right now. One is a parallel tunnel, and another would be kind of building out the cross section of the area that is in most need of additional capacity. So the feasibility study is underway. We expect the results in July, so just next month, and at that time we will identify the preferred alternative and move into the design phase. We expect construction to last several years, starting in 2020, and the price tag of this project is quite impressive, $38 million. And as it's currently programmed in our stormwater utility funds, we are anticipating that we'll need to raise stormwater utility rates that also pay for the other critical infrastructure needs and water quality work that we do. But the rates that we're looking at, between 3 and 5% for the next 5 years, are really driven by this $38 million price tag. And there are some examples of different types of properties and stormwater utility fees that they pay on the slide. And we'd like to minimize the impact to city residents and property owners by pursuing the state bonding dollars, recognizing that any state contribution would be supplemented by the stormwater utility revenue and potentially stormwater utility bonds as well. And as I close, I just want to say that a number of you and your staff have been on tours down in the storm tunnel, and we really appreciate the opportunity to show that impressive infrastructure and that work firsthand. It's time intensive, and it really is something to see firsthand. The top photo on the right was taken this winter as we did work in the Central City Tunnel, Nicollet Avenue, and 4th. And if the project goes forward, we would be happy to be a part of the tour to show people what this looks like and how it not only benefits the city of Minneapolis, but is an asset for economic growth for the region as well. And that is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
We have a question from Council President Johnson.
Madam Chair, Ms. Kessler, can you go back a slide? So is this number, so in 2017, people?
This is what people are currently paying in 2017. What I have done is just projected what might be if we had to increase the rates 3 to 5%, as we think we might have to cover that $38 million. So this has not been adopted. This is something that we are looking at and exploring ways to fund. But if we did move ahead with increasing rates to bear the entire cost, the city ourselves, that is potentially what you might see if you fell into one of those categories.
Okay, so a homeowner is paying $12.36
Per month.
this year,
Mhm.
per month.
Per month.
This year, and then it would, if we had to pay the whole balance, it would go up to $14.79 per month by 2023.
Correct.
Okay. The other question I wanted to ask is, it sort of goes to what Ms. Lesh was talking about earlier about the comparisons between cities. And we have this big stormwater need. What happens with St. Paul? Do they have I mean, they obviously have the same kind of challenges. Where does that bonding request fall in their line?
Madam Chair and Council President Johnson, St. Paul does have stormwater tunnels too, and I know they are doing similar rehab to their tunnels that we are. I'm not aware if they have state bonding dollar requests in for stormwater tunnel work.
Have we ever received state bonding for stormwater tunnels?
Madam Chair and Council President Johnson, my recollection is that there was a request, but we did not receive previous funds for storm tunnel work.
But there was some
Over 35W, so
over
that may have been in
35W.
concert with MnDOT.
That was a different, yeah.
But that was a storm tunnel project. Okay.
Yeah, Madam Chair and Councilmember Johnson, the MnDOT work that you see on the side of 35W still is to increase the capacity at that location and have a better access, and they did receive bonding dollars, and we participated in that with them, but that was a MnDOT request.
I'd be interested to hear if historically, if St. Paul's gotten, and if that's in their, again, if that's in their structure, because they're in a different utility arrangement than we are, because they have that overall utility. It's a different. Anyway, I'd be interested in that. So just about when you're asking, if we're asking for something that is outside of, or is we have internally and somebody else doesn't have internally, just kind of fairness, I guess, is what I'm looking at.
Excellent question.
I'm not seeing other questions, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So we have a proposal for our list in front of us. I did want to ask Ms. Lesh a couple other questions. I know that we have some friends here today who are from the, and I meant friends and friends, not, but who are from the Friends of the Lock and Dam, and they have approached the city about whether we would support a bonding request. There have been other organizations that I've heard from as well. One being Emerge, who contacted me, and some others at the city, I think, also in recent days, to describe their thoughts on state support for their project and why that makes sense. And that's another project that the city has some interest in financial connection to. And so I wanted to hear a little bit from Ms. Lesh on kind of how the Friends of the Lock and Dam, how their project was analyzed, and what thoughts you have on that. And I know that Mr. David Frank from CPED was involved in trying to coordinate some meetings with this group, and he's out of town, unfortunately, today. So.
Madam Chair and council members, as you'll recall in our presentation, one of the top priorities and really the primary way to receive state bonding resources is for a project to be publicly owned. And when I say publicly owned, that also means that the public entity that owns it, they actually own it and they have site control, and that they are responsible for the property. So I would say that for any project that is either not owned by the city or that the city doesn't have a very clearly defined relationship with whomever does actually own the building, it becomes very challenging for us to seek bonding support for that type of a project. So that would, I think, kind of our initial, that's kind of our first kind of litmus test is this actually something that statutorily, constitutionally, we could actually even own and have and be able to fulfill the requirements in Constitution and statute.
Yeah, and I guess one thing that I was recently reminded of, just because we have had actions on our agenda in the past, more policy type actions that were on our federal agenda that had to do with the lock and the dam and other related asks, is that there is kind of a complicated array of federal agencies that touch this property, and understanding some of those relationships, as well as what might be future interest of the federal government in this project, is something I think we also want to make sure that we understand. Maybe you could tell us, is there other options for how we might be able to be supportive to this project, as opposed to the bonding list, which creates some challenges in terms of our obligations to a project that we need more careful consideration of?
Certainly, Madam Chair and council members, I think there are a wide array of opportunities for the city to be helpful in navigating the really kind of complex world that is federal ownership of pretty much anything. We have other properties in the city. We have the post office and things of that nature that we know that are in our city and that are challenging dynamics with the federal government and who owns them and what can be done with them. So I can say that we will be happy to explore those, and there are other programs at the state that just don't have the complex strings attached to them that GO bonds do, whether it be through the Historical Society or Metro Regional Parks funding. There are a lot of other resources and avenues that just don't have the complex nature of the bonding requirements that they have.
Okay. Other questions from council members? Councilmember Frey.
So I guess my first question relates to whether is it city ownership or is it public ownership of the land that relates to the requirement to get the bonding? Because I mean, I think it is public ownership. The city just doesn't own it right now. It's Army Corps of Engineers.
Madam Chair and Councilmember Frye, correct. It needs to be publicly owned. It doesn't need to be city owned. But frankly, I've never seen an entity pursue bonding proceeds for a project that it either didn't own outright or have a contractual agreement with whomever did own the property. So for example, Orchestra Hall, the city, maybe was that 15 years ago or so, agreed to be kind of the fiscal agent, to use that shorthand for Orchestra Hall, where we served in that role when it came to state bonding, but it was Orchestra Hall was a willing participant in that arrangement, and we kind of approached the legislature together, where they still operated the property and were responsible for those for the operations, but we were kind of the submitting fiscal agent. And if you get into a situation then when that public purpose is not continuing to be maintained and they're not operating in the way that they're required to statutorily or constitutionally, then you end up in the situation that the city almost did, where the property then defaults to that owner. So yeah, it's asking for resources for a property that you don't own, or have a clear contractual partnership with whoever actually owns it. I've never seen that, to my mind at least, happen at the Capitol or move forward in that way.
And that differs from Upper Harbor Terminal in that there is a clear contractual relationship between the park board and the city?
Well, the Upper Harbor Terminal is owned by the city, would be the difference.
But it's the park board that's pursuing it.
Well, and I think to Madam Chair's point earlier is that there are ongoing discussions right now that the city owns it, and there are discussions right now about programming it in the long term. What portion of that acreage is going to be for city purpose, and what portion of that acreage is going to be park board purpose. But that is a kind of to your comment that is kind of a joint endeavor.
Yeah.
That you have to have kind of the two willing participants.
So I guess, and this, my question is kind of, we're sort of in a chicken or the egg scenario here, because until the city gets behind the project in some way, then there won't be the ability to have joint ownership because Army Corps of Engineers is requiring that in order to contract. So I mean, I understand if there's not the ability to do it this time around, but I'm trying to figure out what is the solution in the future, because they're looking. I mean, we will be able to have site control in the future. The question is whether Army Corps of Engineers will partner without the city behind it, and I don't think they will.
And Councilmember, I think our department would be very happy to help navigate whatever council decides going forward.
No, I know that. I appreciate it.
Right, and I just want to say too, I do think it's unfortunate that Mr. Frank can't be here, but I know that he has entered into the conversation, and I think we'd want to make sure that we're working with them. It just seems like, especially at this time point, there are some other options where we can work in partnership to see are there other opportunities for pursuing what I think they're seeking is a planning dollars of about $1.5 million or a
Yeah.
million or $1.5 million, and what might be the options for that to kind of give some more time to make sure we are understanding what may be involved if the city did support a future bonding request versus what might be other options for moving forward a project that clearly is in the public interest, but also I think we also, the other thing I just want to say is we probably want to make sure we're careful with what's the context for multiple projects that are connected to the river and the riverfront, and how do we make sure we kind of stay on task with those that we've identified as priorities. So these all seem to be very large projects, Upper Harbor Terminal being one, the Park Board's project around Halls Island, which is more solely a Park Board identified priority, but also then impacts how the legislature as a whole might look at the multiple priorities of the city of Minneapolis. So I think those are just some points to consider. And again, I am not the most involved person on the riverfront issues. There are
And-
others who've been involved in kind of that bigger picture plan and how to identify our priorities. Again, these are all large dollar asks and important to the city's development.
Right. And I mean, I think there are other possibilities going forward, and
Mhm.
I greatly look forward to exploring what they are precisely. I'm less convinced that there's the possibility of the city owning this site and then being stuck with all the costs in the future, simply because the reason that the Army Corps of Engineers presently owns it is for safety mechanisms downriver and along the central riverfront, is to prevent flooding. So I mean, I don't see them just willingly giving the whole thing over and then turning it over to the hands of the city, because that's totally contrary to their core mission. However, they do have an interest in repurposing an existing lock that is no longer used. So, you know, I do understand the dynamic, and I do understand the city's list of priorities. That totally makes sense. But I just want to make sure that again, it seems to be a chicken or the egg situation, and I don't want to toss a really good proposal out for the future. When we've got a willing partner, and when we've got matching dollars as well. Yeah.
Council President Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I heard from my colleague, Councilmember Glidden, that the Park Board had moved the Upper Harbor down in their priorities, and it actually was moved down with what drives me crazy about the very complicated, expensive projects, as you say, on the riverfront, to be replaced by waterworks. And it's a great project, but so I really think it's in our interest at this point to have a discussion with the Park Board so that we figure out by June 16th who's got the Upper Harbor and where it is in our set of priorities. And so I'm going to make a staff direction to direct staff, CPED staff, IGR staff to meet with Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, bring a recommendation to us by the Committee of the Whole next Wednesday regarding the priority for the Upper Harbor. They've got $15 million of park costs. We could probably come up with a number that would be very similar to that, just in utility relocation, which is one of the things that's a big ask on our end on that land. So anyway, I think that's something we should clarify before we send our request into for capital bonding. So report back to us for Committee of the Whole. Then I would like a report for Committee of the Whole on Wednesday also to clear up what our concerns are about the proposal for the Lock and Dam project, and that an assessment of what the challenges are for ownership, for public, what's public ownership, if it's not us, who could it be? And then to let us make a decision then for inclusion or not inclusion on the 16th. So I'll make those two staff directions.
Okay, so Council President Johnson has made some staff directions, and so we will expect a report at the committee of the whole for discussion on those two items. Any discussion on Council President Johnson's motion?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I got the first staff direction. What was the second, Madam?
The second one is requesting a report back on the lock and
Okay.
dam proposal with some more analysis of why or why not we should add this to our list, including what may be the challenges around the
ownership.
public ownership
Yeah.
issue in particular.
Thank-
So,
yeah.
okay.
No, thank you, Madam Vice President, Madam President. I'm very supportive of these two staff directions, and I agree with Council President's desire to have Upper Harbor Terminal moved up on the list. You know, we talk all the time about funding capital improvement projects in North Minneapolis, and then oftentimes it gets the back seat to others. And although Waterworks is a project that is in my ward, I still think that Upper Harbor Terminal holds precedent.
Okay. All right. So on the staff direction, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? And then we have an action in front of us to rank the projects for submission to MMB as the Regional Emergency Operations and Training Facility, number 1, and number 2, the Central City Storm Tunnel Preservation Improvement Project. And so on that initial recommendation, any discussion? All in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? And that item then is approved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, council members.
So next, we are turning to our legislative session update. And Ms. Bergman is getting set up.
Thank you, Madam Chair and council members. Sasha Bergman with the IGR Department. Good afternoon. Brief preview of what we're going to talk about today in terms of wrapping up the 2017 legislative session. We'll be providing some of the developments that have occurred since we were last here in April, providing you with sort of a mid-session update, talk about some of the outstanding issues, and then give you a kind of a rundown of the different policy and budget issues that came out of the legislative session as they pertain to the city's legislative agenda. And then we'll give you a brief preview of things that we anticipate may be coming down the pike in 2018. So when we were here in April, we had updated you on the House and Senate omnibus budget bills that had come out of both bodies. Since that time, the budget bills, the first round of budget bills went to conference committee. The House and Senate worked out their differences, and then the bills were passed and subsequently vetoed by the governor. So he vetoed all of the budget bills in mid-May. Shortly thereafter, just before the May 22nd constitutional adjournment deadline, new budget bills were released, and about half of them passed during the regular session, which again adjourned May 22nd. The House and Senate leadership and the governor were in negotiations and had been making progress on the remaining budget bills, and so the governor called the legislature back into a special session immediately to begin at 12:01 a.m. on May 23rd, I believe, the Tuesday. They were supposed to, they agreed to complete their work by the following day at 7 a.m. That timeline was not met, but they did conclude their work by the end of that week, early Friday morning, and passed the remaining budget bills and sent them to the governor. And since then, the governor did sign all of the budget bills, and they had adjourned until 2018, February 20th, 2018. You'd think that with the signature of all the budget bills, that things would be wrapped up nicely, but actually, there have been some recent developments. The Department of Revenue funding in the state government finance bill was tied to passage of a tax bill, and that was something that the governor had expressed he was not too pleased with. There were also 5 other items that he wanted to negotiate or bring back negotiations on. Elimination of the tobacco tax breaks, cancellation of the estate tax exclusion increase, and removal of the frozen inflator for the state general levy. Those are all items that were in the tax bill. He also wanted the legislature to come back and discuss removal of the driver's license provision in the public safety bill, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly here. And then he wanted to renegotiate the teacher licensure provision. And so in an effort to bring back the legislature to discuss these 5 things that he has significant concerns with, he vetoed or line item vetoed the legislature's appropriation. And so I think the developments since then are essentially that the House and Senate believe that his action to line item veto their funding is unconstitutional and violates separation of powers issues, and they have approved a resolution to hire outside legal counsel. I'm not sure if lawsuit has actually been formally filed, and I think there's discussion that they might have a meeting sometime to discuss the status of things, but otherwise it's kind of in limbo, and we're not actually sure kind of what exactly the next steps will look like. And now I will turn it over to Ms. Lesh to talk about a couple of the budget bills that passed during session.
Right, Madam Chair, back for more. As a recap of the topic that we just concluded talking about, the 2017 capital investment bill, again, you'll see that the city's top 2 priorities of $25 million for 35W and Lake Street and $31.875 million for 10th Avenue Bridge were both included in the final bill, as well as $1.029 million for the Pioneers and Soldiers Cemetery fence restoration. And as we noted, other projects that are located in the city of Minneapolis, you see that list here: Family Partnership, People Center, Norway House, Hennepin Center for the Arts, the Minneapolis Workforce Development Center, which is a state project that DEED manages, and then $5 million for Metro Regional Parks. And the Park Board will receive plus or minus $1 million of those proceeds.
Madam Chair.
Council President.
Madam Chair and Ms. Lesh, the Minneapolis Workforce Development Center, is that the Broadway one, or is it a South Side one?
I think it's the south side.
Is it?
ones.
I think it's the south
okay.
side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If there are no questions on bonding, then I'll move on to transportation. This first slide is going to focus on kind of road and bridge transportation funding, and then the next slide we'll talk a little bit more about transit. As you may have been following, kind of the large policy discussion that was debated between the governor and the legislature over the last couple of years when it comes to transportation was, should Minnesota be dedicating a portion of general fund revenue to transportation purposes? And what they ended up doing in the final sign bill in the special session was to dedicate a portion of primarily sales taxes around auto part sales and motor vehicle lease sales tax revenue to subtract that from the general fund and dedicate that to transportation purposes. So in the first year of the biennium, 18 and 19, that'll be $300 million from the general fund to transportation. And then in the out years, we'll see that dollar amount increase significantly. In the 2021 cycle, that'll be close to $450 million of general fund revenue dedicated to transportation. The second point you'll see here is the shifting of the motor vehicle lease sales tax revenue to the County State Aid Fund, a new Minnesota Transit account for Greater Minnesota Transit, Minnesota State Transportation Fund, and the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. One thing I'll note is that new 13% that's going to be dedicated to the new Minnesota State Transportation Fund is how the legislature chose to approach the funding of bridges around the state. And historically, the local bridge replacement and rehabilitation fund just received annual appropriations, whatever the legislature deemed appropriate for that year or for that biennium. This will be an ongoing funding stream now for those bridges. It's that 13% you see there. Another new policy that the legislature included in the transportation bill was to create a large bridge account and a small bridge account, with the delineating line being $7 million. Any project that in total project cost is above $7 million would be directed towards the larger bridge account, and any project that has a total project cost of under $7 million would be included in the smaller bridge account. The smaller bridge account would be funded first, and any leftover dollars, once all the bridges on the state priority list would be funded, then that leftover money would spill over to the large bridge account, unless, of course, the legislature directly appropriated additional dollars to that large bridge account. Where we spend more of our time, most of our time, I would say, in transportation is, of course, on the topic of transit. It's so important to our residents and businesses in Minneapolis. The Met Council and Metro Transit has a significant structural funding deficit, and the legislature this year did not choose to tackle that ongoing deficit, but instead took a one-time approach and provided $70 million in one-time funding for the Met Council to close their almost $70 million budget deficit for the upcoming biennium. That does retain the current levels of transit service. If you remember, in earlier iterations of the bill, the transportation bill, we were looking at potential 40% reduction in local bus service. That is not going to be included, will not be a result of the funding that's appropriated in the final signed bill. Another item that showed up in the special session bill that was not included earlier was this discussion over the state's share of operating costs for light rail transit lines. And where the legislature ended up was that it shifted 50% share of Southwest Light Rail's operating to Hennepin County. That is just for Southwest and it would not include Botno or additional light rail lines in the future. And with the ability, and you'll see in point number 3, with the ability of Hennepin County and the other 4 counties that are currently in CTIB, with their ability to raise their sales tax to the full half cent, up from the current quarter cent, that's where Hennepin County would then identify the revenue needed to cover the state's 50% operating share for Southwest. You see that in point number 3 there. We also have a study. The Met Council is required to fund a vibration study, the Calhoun Isles condo complex. There's a policy item here that we did work on, and we thank several residents came to the Capitol to oppose legislation that created a funding cap for freight liability when that freight rail is co-located in a corridor with a light rail line, and in particular for cities' purposes, that would currently be the Southwest line. That liability cap language was included in the final transportation bill. And then finally, it established a new active transportation program. The program is not funded, but that would include bike and ped programming into the future. And then, Madam Chair, moving on to public safety and criminal justice reform. Included in this bill was the requirement of 16 continuing education credit hours for law enforcement officers around the state. And we're happy to say that in the city of Minneapolis that these are requirements that MPD already includes in their required coursework, and that what the city of Minneapolis requires was really looked at as a model statewide when this legislation was discussed. And so these new 16 CE units will require things like crisis intervention and mental health crisis training, conflict management and mediation, and recognizing and valuing community diversity and cultural awareness. Those requirements will be permanent, but the funding to support those continuing education requirements will be $6 million for each year over the next 4 years, and then at that point that funding will sunset, and we'll probably go back to the legislature and ask for continued funding to maintain the ability of departments to pursue that level of training.
We had a question from Council President Johnson.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So, Ms. Lesh, this is an additional funding for work that we're already doing. Are we going to get a share of this?
Madam Chair and Council President, this is an allotment to the post board
Yes.
for training.
Okay.
So there will be potentially grant opportunities from the post board. They might run training programs themselves that law enforcement officers could partake in, and this could be used for funding at some of the community colleges that provide law
okay.
enforcement training,
Okay.
to support that build out statewide. So there's a common type of training throughout the state.
So we may be able to use other resources and facilities for training our officers in these programs.
Yes, Council
Okay,
President.
so
Yes.
kind of substituting. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Moving on, you may have heard that in a bill that emerged towards the end of session of the Public Safety Omnibus Bill, there was language added that would prohibit the Department of Public Safety from entering a rulemaking process that would have allowed undocumented immigrants to secure state identification cards and driver's licenses. That was also included in the letter that the governor recently sent to the legislature of the items that he would like to see removed From the current bill, in the larger global discussion around his line item vetoing of the appropriation for the legislature and potential legal battles over that veto. We were successful in extending the city's and other cities' driver diversion program. It was set to sunset on June 30th of 2017. The sunset was extended until June 30th of 2019. A priority for many of our partners in the community, small business owners, residents, property owners, partners in downtown Minneapolis, was the establishment of a new misdemeanor for the willful violation of a geographic restriction. So we were happy to see that included in the final public safety bill. There was some language around the carrying of firearms for off-duty police officers, that cannot be they cannot be prohibited from entering private establishments. And then you'll see at the bottom a few smaller appropriations, $400,000 in FY19 for Pathways to Policing program, which would be a grant program to help those in non-traditional educational or experiential backgrounds enter policing. $250,000 a year for combating terrorism recruitment grants, $180,000 a year for a sex trafficking prevention grant specifically to law enforcement training, and $100,000 a year for training in de-escalation techniques. And then, Madam Chair, moving on to the Jobs and Workforce Development section. You may recall in 2016, there was a significant investment on the part of the legislature in reducing racial disparities and enhancing equity. And there were grants that were made in the 2016 session, appropriations to several community groups, organizations, nonprofits, and of that nature. And in the 2017 session, what the legislature did was reduce at least in several programs, not all, but in many programs, reduce the planned increase in their funding. So we would contend that that is a reduction. The legislature would contend that this was forecasted increases in the 20 and 21 biennial cycle, and that we shouldn't have counted on that money, and that was a forecasted increase. And so reducing a forecasted increase is not in and of itself a reduction. So might not have a meeting of the minds on that one. There was included also in the jobs bill $2 million for Pillsbury United Communities for the North Market project, $319,000 just in one-time appropriation in FY18 for the East Phillips Improvement Coalition to create the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute. And then there were some policy items that I will defer to my colleagues to focus on regarding interim ordinances, the prohibition on plastic bag bans, and the small cell bill.
Madam Chair, again, Sasha Bergman with the IGR department. I think we'll talk about those provisions related to local governance in a slide that's coming up here, but they were contained in the jobs bill. On the tax bill, you may recall that in earlier versions of the tax bills this legislative session, there have been targeted cuts to the city of Minneapolis. In the Senate tax bill, as it passed off of the Senate floor, there was a cut of $28 million to, or rather a cap on Minneapolis's local government aid at $50 million a year starting in 2018, which amounted to a $28 million cut. And in the House bill and in the vetoed tax bill, there was a repeal of the city's library aid, debt service library aid of $4.12 million per year. But happy to report that in the bill that was signed by the governor, ultimately, neither of those two cuts were included in the bill, and there was a $15 million LGA program increase beginning in fiscal year 19, which would amount to a $1.137 million increase for Minneapolis beginning in 2018. Of course, a little bit of that would go to the park board, and that the $15 million is in future years as well, so it's not just one-time increase. There's also a one-time partially early LGA distribution in 2019, just meaning that we would get a percentage of our July payment in June instead of just in July, which for us, I think doesn't probably amount to any issue other than having additional cash flow. And for the state, I think it was a cash flow issue also, relates to their fiscal year starting in July and ending in June. There was the approval of a lot of specific local government requests. The city of Minneapolis did not have any, but you might recall that there hasn't been a tax bill for 2 years. So for a lot of cities who had tax increment financing, special legislation, local option sales taxes, they didn't get their provisions in bills in the past 2 years, but a lot of them were passed this year. And then just a note that in a previous version, there was a construction sales tax refund mechanism for local units of government to be able to take advantage of the sales tax exemption for local or for cities and counties. And because of the way that construction contracts are structured and the way that purchasing of construction materials occurs, it's difficult for local units of government to take advantage of that sales tax exemption. There was a refund mechanism in a previous bill, but that did not ultimately make the final tax bill. And then also happy to report that there were no reverse referendums included in the tax bill. In previous versions, there were reverse referendums on franchise fees that raise revenue beyond defraying utility operations in the city, and on any increase from 1 year to the next on a levy. I mentioned the library aid already, and then just a note that there was, in an earlier version, a prohibition on local units of government requiring a fee on plastic or paper bags, and that was not included in the tax bill or in the jobs bill or in any bill that we're aware of that was signed by the governor.
Council President Johnson.
So does that, when you say there's the construction sales tax exemption refund goes away, does that mean the whole exemption goes away? So there is no more exclusion of sales tax for local government purchases?
Madam Chair and Council President, thank you for the opportunity to clarify. No, the local units of government are still exempt from the sales tax.
Okay.
It's just that when we purchase construction materials,
Right.
because of, I think usually the contractor purchased it and there's some liability
Right.
issues, it was difficult for cities to take advantage of the exemption.
Okay.
And there was an attempt to try to create a mechanism so that
Better.
we could.
Okay.
So
We're
maybe
still,
next
we're
year.
still exempt. We're still
Yeah,
exempt. Okay,
absolutely.
great. Thank you.
In the state government finance bill, Madam Chair, in an earlier version, as we've mentioned in this committee before, there is an agreement in state law to provide $16 million in state contribution and $21 million in employer contribution until 2031 for the Minneapolis Employees Retirement Fund. This past session, of which of course the city is one of the employers, in the vetoed bill, there was a $10 million removal, or a removal of $10 million annually in the state funding beginning in 2017. So what this would have amounted in, if the bill weren't vetoed, would be a $5.6 million cut to the city in 2017, in the year that we've already passed our budget for. What ended up being included in the final agreement between legislative leaders and the governor was a cut to MRF by removing the $10 million annually in state funding beginning in 2019, so next biennium. So this is something that we're going to have to continue to work on up at the legislature. And then also in both versions of the bill, both in the veto bill and in the one that was finally signed, was some authorization for additional long-term equity investment authority for qualifying cities and counties. The qualifying cities is based on your credit rating, and then also for cities who have 100,000 or more in population. So we would be one of them. And it would allow some flexibility for investments in the State Board of Investment and some other items. So something that we worked with the League of Minnesota Cities and the Association of Minnesota Counties on this session. In the world of affordable housing, there was the Home Sprawl Coalition, of which the city is an endorsing organization, had requested or had been advocating for a $100 million investment in affordable housing, and specifically in bonding. What ended up passing was $10 million in general obligation bonds for public housing rehab, $35 million in housing infrastructure bonds, $20 million for 2014 and 15 housing infrastructure bond authorization from excess debt service in 2014 and 15 that was due to low interest rates, and then $12 million for Dorothy Day Phase 2 in St. Paul. There were also some other investments. Homework Starts with Home, which is aimed at ending student homelessness and increasing family stability, and then some one-time increases in the Department of Human Services. I'll also note that there was a policy change in I believe it was in the jobs bill, to authorize cities to create affordable housing trust funds. This bill was authored by Representative Barb Haley from Red Wing. I think the Red Wing HRA and the city of Minneapolis are the only two entities that have, a so-called or affordable housing trust fund at the local level. This was intended to have matching funds from MHFA for any HRA levy revenue that would be flowing into this created affordable housing trust fund at the local level. The matching funds were not included in the final bill. We anticipate that could be something that is continued to be advocated for at the legislature. And we were cautious to make sure that the bill would not adversely impact our existing trust fund. And so we worked with the city attorney's office to make sure that the language would not adversely impact our affordable housing trust fund.
So Ms. Bergman, I'll just kind of weigh in there. I actually hadn't realized that there was some legal impediment to local communities being able to establish affordable housing trust funds. Is there something unique or some financing mechanism this allows that other communities weren't able to utilize? Maybe we're different because we're a charter city. I have no idea. I'm just a little surprised.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. My understanding is that there's not anything preventing local units of government from authorizing them. I think it was to make it clear in statute that this is a tool that cities could use to establish. And I think my understanding is that what we're doing now matches what was provided in the bill language. So it's not anything that couldn't have been done previously, as far as I'm aware from talking with our staff and others at the Capitol.
Okay.
So. And then on the Health and Human Services bill, there was a $2.1 million appropriation for sexually exploited youth. And so I think this kind of rounds out the needed investment that began several years ago to complete the safe harbor for youth to provide shelter and services for sexually exploited youth. And there was also a $73,000 appropriation with a policy direction to complete the Safe Harbor for All strategic plan, so to create a response for adult victims of sex trafficking. So that's something that will be coming down the pike with more discussion probably in next year. There was also no cuts to the local public health grant and no delay in the funding, no cuts to the statewide health improvement partnership, but there was added policy language to ship the statewide health improvement partnership to ensure that at least 2 grants go to opioid prevention. And then lastly, I'll mention that there was pretty significant new investments in home visiting, both for medical assistance reimbursement for nurse home visits and also just for starting or expanding evidence-based programs, $12 million in the upcoming biennium and $33 million in the tails in fiscal 20 and 21. So that was something that was very exciting to see. Well, now we're going to talk about some of the policy issues that we encountered this session. On the local control front, or the local interference front, however you want to look at it, there were a lot of bills that were introduced this session. I think we talked about this in April, to undermine local decision-making, and I know the council took action on a resolution to support local decision-making authority earlier this year. Probably the most widely known one was the preemption bill on local wage and benefit requirements. You've probably heard by now that this was vetoed by Governor Dayton. It was included in one of the special session bills, but it was also coupled with some pension provisions, wage theft prevention provisions, an expansion of health or paid family leave for state employees, and I think one other state contracts, ratification of the state labor contracts. Although the governor liked those other provisions, he did veto the preemption, or that whole bill containing the preemption provision as well, because he had committed to doing that. He said he would be vetoing it. However, I'll note that the preemption bill, as it was traveling through the legislative process this session, made it to conference committee, and there was no outcome from that. And so that would be probably alive for next year, because it's just the second half of the biennium in 2018. As I mentioned, none of the reverse referendum bills made it in a final bill. There was a provision to repeal, or a bill to repeal the city authority to establish special service districts, and that one did not make it in the final bill, but we understand that there may be continued discussion on that issue in the future. We mentioned the plastic bag ban that was included in the jobs bill, prohibiting cities from banning plastic bags. There was the small cell wireless bill allowing unregulated access to public right-of-way, signed in the jobs bill. And then some changes to notifications related to interim ordinances and just passage of ordinances or proposed ordinances in general, which we've alerted the city clerk to, and they'll be kind of working on on steps to make sure that we're in compliance with those. If there are no questions, I will turn it over to Mr. Ranieri.
I just want to do a special acknowledgement of all the work that Sasha did on this, and I'm not going to use the word that you use, but the interference and local control sort of bucket of issues, because it wasn't just issues that were particular to the city of Minneapolis, but these were really statewide issues, and you led efforts to work with the League of Minnesota cities and metro cities and others that really engage cities throughout the state. I think I heard there were maybe 60, over 60, maybe closer to 70 resolutions passed by city councils across the state of Minnesota, from cities as small as Ely to St. Paul and Minneapolis, and from all over the state, who offered their opinion that they did not appreciate the state legislature interfering in the ability of local government to pass laws and ordinances that reflect the desires of their community members. And so I just want to say thank you, and this clearly is something that is going to be an ongoing theme for future years, but you've really established a good, I think, groundwork of a big coalition across the state that understands this issue much better. It's something that I think is one of these sort of legalistic issues, and it's hard sometimes to translate that into what's happening in my backyard, and I think that change has really started to happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and also thank you for all of your work on that during the legislative session. We appreciated your support up at the Capitol. So.
Madam Chair, there was lots of discussion during the session about reorganizing the Metropolitan Council. There was even an attempt to suggest maybe a 27, 28-member council composed of county commissioners and elected officials, as well as some folks from the Department of Transportation. Lots of discussion, some bills were heard. Nothing occurred this session. We expect probably next session more discussion on the future of the Metropolitan Council. The other issue that was a carryover from the prior year was the whole issue dealing with real ID. The bill was passed. It does require the Department of Public Safety to implement and comply with the Real ID Act, which is federal, by October 1st of 2018. It gives us two choices as consumers or driver's license or wanting to get ID cards. We can do a compliant or a non-compliant card. If we want compliant with the Real ID card, there would be more information required, and it would also permit us to board on airplanes and go into certain federal buildings. So it is a choice for either one as we renew our driver's license. It also requires the Department of Public Safety, if there are any changes at the federal level, to bring those back to the legislature before they try to implement them. To do all this, it's $3.27 million for implementation, and it does not include undocumented immigrants' driver's license issue in this bill. Also, if you want to say you want to get your Real ID earlier than when your license expires, there is language in the bill that permits that. I think it's a very small fee, but it does recognize that. The Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority, as you're aware, there was legislation proposed in both bodies, passed by both bodies, went to a conference committee. That conference committee never had its report acted upon, so it is still active. It'll probably come back next year, or could come back next year. What the report did suggest was, or did approve, that the composition of the MSFA be the same as it is today. 5 members, 3 appointed by the governor, 2 appointed by the mayor. However, there are a couple caveats. One, all 5 persons have to be approved by the House and the Senate. In other words, confirmed by the House and the Senate. It's my understanding that there's only 2 other agencies in the state government that have that requirement of both House and Senate. That's the Campaign Finance Board and the Public Utility Commission. The chair used to be appointed by the governor. This conference committee report recommends that that chair be elected by the other members, and I think it would serve a 2-year term. There would be a full-time executive director, and the chair, at least from the beginning for at least I think a year or 2, would have some sort of compensation greater than the other members, but after that it was unclear. There are several rules and procedures dealing with the use of the suites that are owned by MSFA or controlled by MSFA, and then the disposition of those suites caused lots of concerns, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why the bill may have been held. And then there's lots of reporting and public disclosure. The website of the MSFA will be having an awful lot of information and documents that would be required to be published there. On the liquor bill, Sunday sales, as we're aware, came earlier in the session. I think it was on Chapter 6. Then the Super Bowl also is in the tax bill, but the Super Bowl went through a little bit of change. It is now statewide. So there is Representative Howell from Stearns County offered an amendment on the floor of the House. He did offer an amendment in the committee, and it failed, but he did it on the floor, and it was adopted. So the hours that you can be open till 4 o'clock, I think from Thursday morning to the Monday after the Super Bowl game, are not just here in Ramsey and Hennepin County, but also statewide. There are also some local bills. One was for Upton 43, a restaurant, I think in the 13th ward, and a food hall, which is in the 2nd ward, and that was an amendment on the floor, and that was Representative Omar's amendment. There are also many changes to the size and hours for brewers and wineries and distilleries, and we will have more detail in our general summary coming out in a couple weeks. Elections. The bill was signed by the governor. It allows for the use of a electronic polling place roster system. It also puts a $7 million appropriation for counties and cities to purchase replacement equipment or the electronic polling place system. And there seems to be a priority put on the electronic polling place roster system because you can get up to 75% of the cost covered by the state, but other equipment would be up to 50%. I would think there's going to be an awful lot of folks in line, so I don't know if they'll ever get up to the 75% match, but it'll be implemented by the Secretary of State. And we, the night this was passed, we sent an email to City Clerk, and he's on top of it, and we're going to be working on it. And then it also establishes 5 specific dates for special elections. So there are 5 dates right in statute now if they need to have a special election. And then can't explain it, but what's codified in statute right now is the little sticker says I voted. It is now official. Another issue was the condo bill. Even though it passed significantly in both the House and the Senate, there was some opposition, particularly from some of our legislators. What the whole purpose was, or the idea was, that maybe one of the things that's causing the lack of condos being built was the construction defect lawsuits coming in the 8th and 9th year warranties. What this bill does, and it was changed on the Senate floor rather significantly, it has, first of all, it is prospective. It will only apply to those condo associations established after the 1st of August in 2017. It requires a notification process to the owners of condos in the association if there's going to be a lawsuit. It requires approval by a majority. It also requires, for all condos, even those that are established before 2017, a maintenance plan, budget, schedule, and program for maintenance. And then also, if there's going to be litigation, mediation, except if you follow the process in Chapter 327A, you don't need to go to mediation. Also, there's a concern about the payment of attorney fees. That was not changed at all. It was changed in the House bill. It remains under current law, which was a big change from what was being proposed. And in terms I'll stand for any questions. Okay. For potential 218 issues, limousine tinting issue, I think Melissa can go into detail on that if you wish us to. It's a bill that was sitting on the floor. Oh, I'm sorry.
Madam Chair and council members, this was a bill brought forward by the City Attorney's Office in our policy liaison process. Just a technical bill cleaning up the definition on who can and cannot have their windows tinted dark. It passed the committees and it's just sitting on the floor of the House and Senate chambers. You may recall a significant issue having to do with workers' compensation and a court decision in terms of how the para offset for work comp is calculated. That was included the Department of Labor and Industry's fix for this problem was included in the Work Comp Advisory Council's bill. As that bill moves through the legislative process, there's always a traditional understanding that that bill is not to be amended in any way, shape, or form, and if it is, it has to go back to the Work Comp Advisory Council. It's treated unlike most other legislation. Well, along the way, an amendment was added on the Senate floor that made changes to how post-traumatic stress disorder is handled when it comes to workers' compensation, for lack of more time and detail. And so by that being added on the Senate floor, it caused the author to withdraw the bill for the year because it had circumvented that traditional Work Comp Advisory Council process. So that will probably be left there for 2018.
Madam Chair, we have talked about local wage and benefit preemption. I think it could come back. Reverse referenda possibilities, enhanced penalties for protesters, I think was in some of the bills and was dropped out. The undocumented immigrant driver's license issue, I think will be revisited. MSFA, transit funding gap, again, will be a big issue. Met Council governance, and then the budget issues depending on the November and February forecast. One item I'd like to add, and that's pensions. There was an omnibus pension bill. It was passed by the Senate, didn't get heard in the House, was actually included in the vetoed preemption bill. And that pension bill has an awful lot of sustainability measures to sustain and maintain all the pension programs and all the pension funds. So I think that'll be coming back in 2018. And Madam Chair, with that, we'll stand for questions.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any, maybe one question, Council President Johnson, or comment.
No question,
Okay.
Madam Chair, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to compliment IGR staff on what was such a challenging year that, as the chair said, we did as well as could be expected and better. And it's your professionalism and the respect that people have for you that did us so well in the session. So thank you.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. I think I heard Mr. Ranieri, and I won't say how many years, but in his career, long career as working to influence policy at the state capitol, has never seen a session like this, just with how unusual it was, and in so many ways. And I hear every time, honestly, every single time that I travel to meet with legislators or do whatever I'm assigned to do at the Capitol, how much respect that staff over there, others who make their careers working as lobbyists and legislators have for our staff team as a whole. You just really have built an excellent reputation, and I think the fact that we did in such a challenging year have such significant accomplishments for the city of Minneapolis in terms of safeguarding our critical funding, moving forward on tremendous capital needs for the city, and other policy accomplishments to come out of a session like this in the good shape that we are for the future, I think just is really, really amazing. So thank you to everyone. Your work is very much appreciated. With that, let's move to receive and file. On approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And with that, I believe we have concluded with our business for today.
Madam Chair, yes, I'd like to thank my staff and also our intern who is going to be moving on to working for another nonprofit organization, Megan Jacket, and she was from St. Olaf and helped us all session. And also I'd like to thank our staff for their tremendous work, and also thank you, Madam Chair, because you won't be here next year in this position, and we thank you so much for all the years you chaired our committee, and we'll see you in the next couple of months. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, yes, and special thank you to Megan, and good luck. And you got an opportunity to work with just a fantastic team. So anyway, we're glad to have had you here. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Great job, guys.